Ever wonder which nations are secretly boosting their air power with one of the most advanced fighter jets on the planet? The Gripen, Sweden's answer to modern aerial combat, is gaining serious traction worldwide. But who exactly is putting their trust in this nimble powerhouse? And what does it tell us about the future of global air defense? Forget what you think you know about the global arms race. While headlines focus on the usual suspects, a quiet revolution is happening behind the scenes, centered around a sleek, underestimated fighter jet, the Swedish Gripen. Discover the surprising countries that are quietly building their air superiority with this formidable aircraft, and why it's changing the face of modern warfare. For years, the Gripen has quietly held a reputation in the fighter jet market. Not the flashiest, not the most expensive, but perhaps the smartest choice. While the world was dazzled by billion-dollar programs like the F-35, Sweden's Gripen built its case differently, with affordability, agility, and technology that punches far above its price tag. But here's the twist. The Gripen is no longer just a favorite of Sweden's close allies. New horizons are opening up. Countries you might not expect are now studying Saab's fighter jet as their air defense budgets grow and geopolitics shift. The long-standing appeal of the Gripen is simple. It costs less than half of what most Western fighters demand, around $8,000 per flight hour, compared to nearly $18,000 for the F-35. Its maintenance footprint is smaller, meaning even smaller air forces can keep them flying consistently. And yet, it packs advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems, and weapons compatibility that rivals far more expensive jets. In an era where defense ministries are under pressure to get maximum value, that's a powerful equation. So who's showing interest now? Beyond Sweden, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Brazil, the nations we usually associate with the Gripen, there are whispers of new tenders. Reports suggest that countries in Eastern Europe, Africa, and even parts of Asia are looking closely at the aircraft. Why? Because these regions want advanced jets, but without being locked into the US-Russia arms rivalry. The long-standing appeal of the Gripen is simple. It costs less than half of what most Western fighters demand, around $8,000 per flight hour, compared to nearly $18,000 for the F-35. Its maintenance footprint is smaller, meaning even smaller air forces can keep them flying consistently. And yet, it packs advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems, and weapons compatibility that rivals far more expensive jets. In an era where defense ministries are under pressure to get maximum value, that's a powerful equation. So who's showing interest now? Beyond Sweden, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Brazil, the nations we usually associate with the Gripen, there are whispers of new tenders. Reports suggest that countries in Eastern Europe, Africa, and even parts of Asia are looking closely at the aircraft. Why? Because these regions want advanced jets, but without being locked into the US-Russia arms rivalry. The timing is critical. Defense budgets are rising worldwide, partly due to tensions in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Nations that once postponed jet acquisitions are suddenly accelerating programs. The Gripen, with its mix of Western tech and independence from US export restrictions, is finding itself in the spotlight. In other words, this isn't just about a fighter jet anymore. It's about nations carving out space in a rapidly polarizing global order. And if there's one country that perfectly illustrates just how far the Gripen's influence is spread, it's Brazil. When Brazil signed its deal for the F-39E/F Gripen, it wasn't just buying a fighter jet, it was buying into a partnership. Unlike traditional sales where aircraft simply arrive pre-packaged from abroad, Brazil secured something far more valuable: technology transfer. Saab agreed to share critical know-how, training Brazilian engineers and enabling local production. This means Brazil isn't just flying Gripens, it's building them. In fact, Embraer, Brazil's aerospace giant, has already been assembling aircraft on home soil, a massive leap for Latin America's defense industry. Now let's pause here. Imagine being a neighboring country watching Brazil's Air Force suddenly leapfrog a generation ahead. For decades, Latin America's skies have been dominated by outdated fleets, F-5 Tigers, Mirage jets, and second-hand imports. Suddenly, Brazil fields a fifth-generation level system in a fourth-generation price tag. This isn't just modernization, it's a regional power shift. Brazil now positions itself not just as South America's largest economy, but also as its undisputed air power leader. That changes calculations for everyone, from Argentina to Colombia. But the real genius of Brazil's move lies in what happens beyond the cockpit. By securing local production and maintenance capabilities, Brazil ensures it won't be dependent on foreign suppliers for decades. Think about it. While other nations wait in line for spare parts or upgrades, Brazil can service its fleet at home, train its own workforce, and even use that expertise to influence future designs. For Saab, this was more than a sale. It was an investment. By anchoring itself in Latin America through Brazil, Saab has planted the seeds for a long-term market presence. And here's the real suspense. Brazil's success with the Gripen could inspire others. Which nations might follow its lead, and how would that reshape alliances across the globe? If Brazil's embrace of the Gripen has shifted the balance in Latin America, then Europe tells a very different but equally fascinating story. Here, the debate is not just about technology, but about identity. Should nations cling to U.S. dominance with the F-35 or carve out independence with Sweden's Gripen? Across Eastern Europe, many air forces are still flying aging Soviet-era fleets, MiG-29s and Su-27s, designed for a different century. These aircraft are increasingly expensive to maintain, vulnerable in modern air combat, and politically problematic after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's why discussions are intensifying in countries like Slovakia, Croatia, and even Poland about how best to modernize. While Washington is pushing hard for the F-35, the Gripen offers an alternative: Western interoperability, but with fewer strings attached. Take Hungary and the Czech Republic. Both nations have been operating the Gripen for years, and despite relentless pressure to join the F-35 program, they're holding firm. Why? Because Gripen has proven exactly what was promised: low operating costs, NATO-compatible systems, and, crucially, independence from the political and financial burden of America's flagship jet. For smaller economies, that balance matters. Instead of draining budgets to keep a handful of F-35s in the air, they can operate larger numbers of Gripens consistently, ensuring real readiness rather than symbolic capability. And then there are NATO's newest members, who face a unique dilemma. They need fighters that can integrate seamlessly with the alliance, but they also need something affordable, sustainable, and quickly deployable. That's where the Gripen quietly shines. Its smaller logistics footprint and rapid turnaround times make it perfect for smaller air forces that want to punch above their weight. What this reveals is bigger than any single aircraft. It's about NATO's cohesion. If too many nations lock themselves into the F-35, the alliance risks creating a costly, inflexible system. But if the Gripen spreads, NATO could evolve into a more adaptable, diversified force. The question is, will these Eastern Bloc nations resist the pressure and choose the pragmatic path? Or will the gravitational pull of the F-35 prove irresistible? The next few years could redefine Europe's aerial balance. After Latin America and Europe, The Gripen's next big test lies thousands of miles away in one of the most contested and fast-changing regions on the planet, the Asia-Pacific. Here, defense budgets are climbing like never before. Why? Because Southeast Asian nations, from the Philippines to Vietnam, find themselves caught between rising Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and their own outdated fleets. Many are still flying Cold War-era jets like the F-5 or early F-16s, aircraft that simply can't meet today's demands. This is where the Gripen could quietly become a game-changer. For countries seeking cutting-edge capabilities without the crippling costs of high-profile jets, Sweden's fighter presents a rare opportunity. The Gripen's strengths align almost perfectly with Asia-Pacific needs. Lower operating costs mean cash-strapped nations can keep their squadrons flying without draining defense budgets. Advanced avionics and electronic warfare systems make it competitive against more expensive Western platforms. And perhaps most importantly, adaptability. Gripen can operate from rough airstrips and requires fewer ground crew, exactly what smaller nations with limited infrastructure need. For countries that want capability without dependency, that's an attractive formula. Of course, the Gripen isn't entering an empty market. It faces competition on two fronts. From the US, the F-16 remains a proven, heavily exported option. Washington sweetens deals with training packages and political alliances. From China and Pakistan, the JF-17 Thunder offers an ultra-low-cost solution that appeals to nations prioritizing quantity over quality. But here's where the Gripen differentiates itself. It bridges the gap. More advanced and survivable than the JF-17, but far cheaper to operate than the F-16 or F-35. For Southeast Asia, it might just represent the sweet spot between affordability and cutting-edge capability. The stakes are high. If Saab secures even a single major deal in Southeast Asia, it could spark a domino effect across the region. The question now is, who will be the first to take that leap? So far, we've seen how the Gripen is reshaping skies in Latin America, holding ground in Europe, and eyeing opportunities across Asia-Pacific. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Gripen isn't just a fighter jet anymore. It's a piece on the global chessboard. Every sale of a Gripen has strategic weight. When Brazil signed its deal, it wasn't just about air power. It was about reducing reliance on U.S. suppliers and creating a new axis of defense cooperation. When Eastern European nations stick with Gripen despite pressure, they're sending a quiet signal. They value independence as much as firepower. In this sense, Gripen isn't competing plane for plane with the F-35. It's offering something more subtle, an alternative path. For nations that don't want to be locked into U.S. politics or into the high costs of American jets, Gripen represents freedom of choice. Think of Gripen as the world's middle ground fighter. Too advanced to be considered cheap like the JF-17, but far more cost-effective than the F-35, which is still struggling with soaring maintenance costs and political baggage. That middle ground makes Gripen attractive for countries seeking balance, cutting-edge performance, but without breaking defense budgets or sacrificing sovereignty. So where might the next big sale come from? Let's look at the map. Eastern Europe. As tensions with Russia persist, countries replacing Soviet-era fleets may choose Gripen over U.S. jets to diversify suppliers. Southeast Asia. The Philippines and Vietnam face urgent modernization needs, and Gripen fits their budgets and geography. Africa. Nations like Botswana have already expressed interest, and South Africa's experience with Gripen could inspire others on the continent. These aren't just deals, they're signals. Each new contract subtly shifts alliances, strengthens Sweden's defense diplomacy, and forces larger powers to rethink their strategies. The real suspense is this. In a world where military power defines influence, could a relatively small country like Sweden end up reshaping the balance of air power? The Gripen might not dominate headlines like the F-35, but its growing footprint tells a deeper story, one of strategy, sovereignty, and the quiet rise of an underdog fighter jet. And if history is any guide, the next Gripen deal won't just be a contract, it'll be a geopolitical statement. If you found this deep dive into the Gripen's global journey as fascinating as we did, don't stop here. At SkyJet Wings, we bring you the latest defense updates, original research, and untold stories shaping the future of air power. Dive in, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon, and join our growing community of aviation and defense enthusiasts.